Hey guys, Spudknocker here, as always, and today we're going to go through a very basic walkthrough on how to self-designate laser-guided bombs from your favorite DCS World aircraft module. There's a lot of tutorials out there on how to actually go through the switchology of the procedure of dropping laser-guided bombs, such as press this button, then press that button, then press this button to shine the laser, drop that bomb there, and then eventually it'll hit the target. However, there's not any tutorials out there on how you should actually fly through the procedure of dropping laser-guided bombs, not just the button presses you have to make. I wanted to address this in this video here and give you guys some tips and tricks as well as some best practices of how to actually fly through the procedure of self-designating laser-guided bombs. By doing one-on-one trainings with lots of new DCS World players, I can see a lot of the issues that players have when it comes to performing certain procedures in their favorite aircraft in DCS. And I'm going to go over a lot of the biggest issues that I see when it comes to self-designating laser-guided bombs in any aircraft in DCS World. This tutorial will cover basics for any aircraft, not just the F-16 we're going to be flying in this actual video here, but any aircraft that can self-designate laser-guided bombs like the AV-8B Harrier 2, F-14 Tomcat, F-18C Hornet, F-16C, and many others that are to come in the future. So I hope you guys enjoy watching this video, and I hope it kind of clarifies some things of how you should actually fly through the procedure of dropping laser-guided bombs, not just what buttons to press. And before we get started, we'll go ahead and plug our new channel sponsor, Leading Edge Supplements. They make a really fantastic cognitive and energy-enhancing supplement called Severe Clear that's made by pilots and for pilots, because energy drinks and go pills and things of that nature just make you far too jittery and make you crash far too hard to be safe for use in the cockpit. It's a really fantastic product that I actually really do like, and it helps me get through multiple flights in real life and be able to come back and make awesome DCS World content for you guys. So make sure you use the code SPUD for 15% off your order of Severe Clear, and I think you guys will really like it, whether you're up in the sky in a real cockpit or flying your trade over Syria or the Persian Gulf in DCS World. So let's go ahead and get started with the tutorial, guys. Alrighty guys, welcome back to the office of the F-16C Fighting Falcon as we fly over the very flat desert of eastern Syria on our way towards An Nasiriyah Air Base to engage some Syrian Arab Air Force aircraft that are on the ramp there. And as I said in the intro, today we're going to be going over some tips and tricks, some best practices, and kind of doing a walkthrough on how you guys can employ your targeting pod to self-laze laser-guided bombs in not just the F-16 that we have here, but any aircraft in DCS World that has the self-designate capability. Whether that's your AV-8B, your F-14, your F-18, or any other aircraft in the sim now or in the future. So let's go ahead and get started. As a result of my working with quite a few people who are brand new to DCS World, I have a good insight as to what trips up most DCS World pilots when it comes to different procedures they're trying to tackle in their chosen aircraft. When it comes to self-designating LGBs, the biggest thing, in my opinion, that really trips people up is task saturation and resulting loss of situational awareness. So let's go ahead and pause this simulation and go ahead and talk about this in a little bit more depth. When you are going to go ahead and engage targets with your targeting pod and self-designate for your LGBs, it's always very important to have a plan and know where you are, where your target is, and where you are in relation to that target. So let's look around us outside of our cockpit here. Obviously, we're over a very flat and featureless desert. But this ridge, this mountain ridge that runs off of our right-hand side underneath our nose and off in about our 11 o'clock-ish position here, if we follow that ridge is going to lead us all the way to Damascus, the capital of Syria. We also know that An Nasiriyah Air Base is just north of Syria, roughly about 30 nautical miles, which really isn't that far when you're in an F-16. Also keep in mind that you want to know where you are in relation to that target. We know that we have a target at waypoint 2, which is situated right on top of An Nasiriyah Air Base. So let's go ahead and continue with the simulation here. Also, another thing that's going to reduce some of that task saturation is to reduce the amount of information that's being forced into your brain. While it's very cool to have your HMD turned on in the F-16 or F-A-18C, it can really be kind of annoying and kind of a nuisance when you're trying to do a very heads down and very information centric operation such as self-designating laser guided bombs. So we'll go ahead and turn that off. As well as the F-16's HUD is very cluttered. Other aircraft in DCS don't have quite as cluttered of a HUD, but decluttering your HUD can also reduce the amount of information that's being squeezed into your brain and kind of reduce some of that task saturation. So let's go ahead and turn off those altitude and airspeed ladders, and that makes for a much nicer picture through our HUD here in the F-16. Also, just for the sake of a demonstration here, we're going to turn off our autopilot, and we can see that our aircraft is very gently rolling to the right hand side. Now, to very easily trim out your aircraft, whether that's the F-18, the F-16, F-14, or any other aircraft in DCS World, the best way to trim it out, in my opinion, is to give very quick taps to the trim hat. So as we feel the airplane gently roll to the right hand side, which may be hard to see on a small YouTube screen, I'm just going to give left wing down gentle taps. Now we can see we're starting to come to the left hand side now. I'm going to give it another couple taps, maybe 1 or 2 taps coming to the right. And now that's pretty darn trimmed out. The more trimmed out your aircraft is, the easier everything is going to be. Especially when you're looking heads down in the cockpit, you don't have to worry about the aircraft's attitude coming into a steep bank or coming nose high or nose low or anything like that when you aren't particularly paying attention to the outside area around your aircraft. Also, keep in mind that having the autopilot on, particularly in altitude hold mode, is going to be very helpful as in terms of reducing your pilot workload. You can spend more time and more brain cells on your targeting pod and finding targets and lining up your drop of your LGB rather than spending those brain cells on actually flying the aircraft. Attitude hold mode on autopilots can also be very helpful when using laser guided bombs or trying to find targets with your laser guided bombs if you want to keep a prolonged climb or descent coming in for you. And keep in mind that all aircraft that have a self-designating capability in DCS World have more or less the same autopilot modes, whether that's your Harrier, your Tomcat, your Hornet, whatever. We also want to practice flying the aircraft gently, precisely, and smoothly. The more gentle, precise, and smooth your control inputs are, the easier it's going to be to find targets with your targeting pod, as well as line up your fall line for a good and accurate drop to make sure your bomb falls within an area that it can actually find the laser spot and then subsequently track it. So try just gently flying your Harrier, your F-16, your Tomcat around in altitude hold mode, and just keep the aircraft just nice and smooth and gentle as you're flying it. Next, you want to beforehand set up your weapons and be ready to go before you get to the combat area. Now, 17 nautical miles before we get to our target area is not far enough, but for the sake of this demonstration, we had to kind of shorten the distances a little bit. So in our F-16 here, we'll go into air-to-ground mode. We'll select CCRP mode to make sure that our targeting pod is going to be slaved to our waypoint, and we'll select our target waypoint, which is going to be waypoint 2. So we'll go ahead and open up our targeting pod, and at this point we're going to go ahead and pause the simulation one more time and actually talk about targeting pods and finding targets with those subsequent pods. So let's go ahead and go to the F2 view. We know that our target is going to be off our left of the aircraft at about our 10 to 11 o'clock-ish position. Our waypoint 1 that we were flying to just for navigational purposes was off of our nose at our 12 o'clock position. Now, if we look at our pod is going to be mounted on the right-hand side of our aircraft, which is on the opposite side from the side we're going to be turning towards our target area. This means that our pod is more likely to be masked when it's looking off to our left-hand side of our aircraft than it is on the right-hand side of the aircraft. This means that as you're orbiting the target area, it's more beneficial to be orbiting in a right-hand orbit around the target area than a left-hand orbit. Keep in mind that different aircraft have the targeting pod on different sides of the aircraft, as well as keep in mind that the further the pod is mounted from the center line of the aircraft, the more likely it is going to be masked by stores hanging off of your wings or the airframe of your aircraft itself. Keep in mind that the Lightning targeting pod, which is the main targeting pod used by DCS World modules as of early 2021, works nearly exactly the same in every module. The keybinds to get to these functions are a little bit different between aircraft, but every targeting pod in DCS World has a FOV zoom, which steps the zoom in very far and steps it out very far, as well as a more finer zoom control that you can zoom in and out as you need to zoom in on a target to identify it, or then zoom back out to then watch the bomb actually hit the target and get a very cool CNN-esque view. Also keep in mind that the targeting pod is not going to be able to see directly behind it, but it can see very far to the sides. So I would say there's only about a 20-degree arc behind the pod itself that it cannot see. So as you overfly your target, when you drop your LGB, eventually, maybe a couple seconds after your bomb actually impacts, your pod will be masked and you won't necessarily be able to see the full aftermath of your bomb impact. Another advantage that a targeting pod gives you over, say, an internally mounted system such as the ARB system in the AV-8B Harrier is that large field of view. You can see targets almost all the way around your aircraft or directly below your aircraft. This means that you do not have to be flying directly at your target to find the target, pinpoint it, and then start your attack run. This is very, very important, especially when it comes to mission types such as DEED or destruction of enemy air defenses, because you do not have to be closing with those air defenses to actually look at it, zoom in with your pod, and find it. You could be flying perpendicular to it or even away from those air defenses, keeping you at a safe standoff distance from that SAM launcher or that AAA battery. So let's go ahead and unpause and continue on. Now, in every aircraft, you have to actually assign your Hotas Controls to the screen or display that is actually displaying the feed of your targeting pod. In the F-16 here, we go display management switch down to make the pod our SOI or sensor of interest. In the F-18, you use the sensor control switch, as well as the AV-8, and in the F-14, don't worry about it, your Rio in the back seat is going to do all the work for you. So we're going to go ahead and make about a 270-degree turn to the right-hand side to come towards our target area. Eventually our pod is going to be masked, but the reason why I'm doing a 270-degree turn to the right-hand side as opposed to the left-hand side is I want to build some more separation out away from the target. So instead of turning 90 left and coming right towards the target area, I need to have a little bit more time to actually pinpoint some of the bad guy aircraft that are down here on the ramp at An Nazariya. So as I fly around the 270-degree turn here, I'm going to be coming back in and then be able to have more time with the pod on the right-hand side of the jet, looking off the right-hand side of the aircraft to then be able to pinpoint a target while not flying directly towards it. Like I said, we're kind of keeping a good standoff distance to make sure that we don't get within range of air defenses as we're trying to find our target. We can also see that as the target passes behind 180 degrees behind us, the fall line will swap from the left-hand side of the HUD to the right-hand side of the HUD. Please also note the way I'm flying the aircraft. We have it in altitude hold mode, and I'm flying the aircraft very gently. If you look at the controls indicator, I'm just barely moving the controls. I'm letting the aircraft fly itself. This is going to reduce my workload as the pilot and allow me to concentrate more on the weapon systems and displays of the aircraft than actually flying it. Also, always pay attention to your throttle as you're working very complex systems in the aircraft, because many times I see pilots trying to find targets with their targeting pod and neglect where their throttle position is, getting into a very nose-high attitude, getting very slow, stalling, and then falling out of the sky. It's not a pretty picture, and you definitely don't want to be that guy. Similarly, pilots will sometimes push their throttle all the way up into afterburner and then accidentally get into a nose-low attitude be concentrating so hard on their targeting pod feed that they then hit the ground and don't know why or what just happened to them. Similarly, we want to make sure that when we look at our targeting pod feed, we're not just glued to it. I recommend not leaning in and use your head tracking to zoom in on the pod and see the display easier. I recommend using the keybinds zoom in slow and zoom out slow. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. The keybinds that we're looking for are zoom in slow and zoom out slow. I always have these on my Hotas, no matter what aircraft I'm flying. So that way I can keep my head tracking with my track IR back, looking at the entire cockpit and be able to look around my aircraft very easily for threats. And then if I need to go in and look at my targeting pod, I can zoom in easily with the zoom in slow and zoom out slow commands on my Hotas. When it comes to actually looking for targets, keep in mind that you have to be looking through the SOTA straw view of your targeting pod, but do not neglect the view on your HUD or the view outside of your aircraft. Make sure you're always checking and looking around, not just at the targeting pod, but everything around you. This will keep you from getting into those bad situations of getting too fast, too slow, nose up, nose down, way banked, all the way upside down, or something crazy like that. So let's go ahead and roll wings level. And you'll note at this point, I'm not flying directly towards An Nazariya. The reason for this is we're trying to keep that good standoff distance. So at this point, we can go ahead and zoom in, and let's go ahead and pinpoint one of those targets we want to actually hit. So we'll go ahead and zoom in here. And we can see a MiG-21. That looks like a perfect target for us to hit. And it looks like there's a MIL Mi-24 peeking out from one of these shelters here. But let's go ahead and hit the MiG-21 first. First thing we're going to need to do now that we have a target pinpointed is, of course, zoom out and look around. Make sure that there's no enemy interceptor on your tail. Make sure you're not getting engaged by a SAM system. There's no AAA puffs all the way around you. Make sure your attitude of your aircraft is wings level and good to go. Next, of course, we need to zoom back in, and we need to actually pinpoint this point where that MiG-21 is as a target. In the F-16, we go TMS right, and that is now our target. In the F-18 or the AV-8B, you go TDC depress. In any aircraft, it could be a little bit different, but for every time we need to drop an LGB from any aircraft, we have to tell the LGB and the weapon systems of the aircraft that is the point we want to drop it on, and that is the thing we want to destroy. So TMS right in the F-16, and then we'll go TMS forward to initiate a point track on that point. We can, of course, cycle through different camera views for white hot, black hot, or TV. And so for this point, because it's actually quite bright outside, we can just go ahead and leave it on TV mode. Next, we can go ahead and start turning in towards our target area. Now that we have an area pinpointed, we can go ahead and come on in. As you get better and better at flying the aircraft and keeping good normal flight attitudes, you can go ahead and pop the autopilot off and turn a little bit harder. But keep in mind, when we're flying in a combat area, we always want to make sure that we have our speed up. We got 30 degrees to go. I recommend having your speed at least 350 knots, so that way you have plenty of energy in your aircraft to avoid things like SAMs, interceptors, AAA, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to go ahead and plug the burners for a little bit more, keep our speed up, and then we're going to bring our throttles back out into full mil. And we'll go ahead and pause the simulation one more time. As you guys saw, as we flew through that almost 90-degree turn, our targeting pod stayed on the same point. As we're flying around, keep in mind that the targeting pod will try to maintain its field of view on the exact same spot that you chose. Do not be preoccupied with the view of the targeting pod as you're maneuvering your aircraft. I've seen a lot of pilots get into a lot of bad flight attitudes because they're too obsessively looking at the view of the targeting pod rather than flying their jet. You always have time on the run into the target to move your TDC around to get and make sure the targeting pod is looking directly at the point you want the bomb to hit. With a 2,000-pound GBU-10, though, like we have on our wing, we can go ahead and hit the aircraft on the wing here, or a little bit off behind the trailing edge of the right wing of this MiG-21, and still completely obliterate it. Keep in mind to always pay attention to the type of target you're hitting. A very soft target, like a MiG-21 here, the drop doesn't have to be absolutely perfect to completely destroy it. If you're going after, say, a T-72, though, your pinpoint accuracy is much more important, because if you just miss that tank by just a little bit, you may make a really bad day for the crew, but the tank eventually, in the end, will still be operational. So let's go ahead and zoom back out here. Also keep in mind, guys, that a lot of new DCS World pilots, when they are flying around, after zooming in or leaning in towards their MFD, they're going to keep their view very much zoomed in and then be trying to fly around like this. This is really difficult to fly the aircraft accurately and keep normal flight attitudes while way zoomed in. Zoom out, guys. It's okay to zoom out and keep your field of view nice and wide and take in as much of the picture as you can around you on your screen. It'll help you fly the jet much, much better. I absolutely promise. So next we have to actually get the aircraft onto the fall line here. This is where your precise flying really needs to come into play. It is really, really difficult for new pilots or pilots who haven't practiced this very much to fly a very accurate CCRP drop. As you're flying, make sure that you have your altitude hold mode turned on, especially if you're new to this. That will very much help, as well as we need to quickly turn on our laser arm here in the F-16. Now, like I said, with everything else in this tutorial, different aircraft will have different ways of actually arming their laser, but that is definitely something we need to pay attention to. As we're trying to fly the fall line, we want to make sure the line is directly inside the middle of our velocity vector. If it's off to the left or to the right, the bomb could miss by being pulled off to the left or to the right of the target area. But the more centered our fall line is, the more accurate our CCRP drop is going to be. We also have the release cue, which is up here. And within 10 seconds of actually coming towards our target area, that release cue will start to fall down our fall line. And as it falls down the fall line, we want to then start depressing the pickle button. That is the weapon release button and can be attributed to different names for different aircraft. But once we press and hold that pickle button, we're authorizing the computer of the aircraft itself to actually drop the weapon when it believes is the best time to drop it for the most accurate drop onto the target. This is true for both laser-guided bombs and thumb bombs. You can make a CCRP drop in with a non-guided weapon as well. So we're going to zoom out, and we can all still see the view of the HUD, no problem. But we're zoomed out to just make sure that we're taking in as much of the picture as possible. And as we fly and make corrections to stay on the fall line, we're only going to bank the aircraft just a couple degrees left or right to make corrections. We don't want to be over controlling the aircraft as we fly towards our target area here. All right, we've got 35 seconds to weapon release, as we can see on the HUD. If you guys haven't seen this before, we've got 9.2 nautical miles to our drop point and 31 seconds. We're just making those gentle corrections, just a couple degrees of bank at a time. Just moving the stick left and right. You can see on the controls indicator just how small my movements of the stick are. We're keeping it nice and centered, not over controlling the aircraft, not over correcting. You can see the release cue is coming down. We're pressing our weapon release button and drop. We're going to go ahead and pause it one more time. You guys can see that we now have a GBU-10 on our right-hand side and no GBU-10 on our left-hand side. Of course, that means we got a good drop, but our aircraft is now very imbalanced. At this point, we're going to need to, of course, trim out the aircraft to make sure that we can fly the aircraft well on our second pass to engage another target. But at this point, we're going to go ahead and just hold our stick to the left-hand side and just hold it there as well as we can. We want to keep the aircraft coming off at the same heading so that way we can continue to have our targeting pod looking at our point so that way we can laze for the bomb itself. So let's go ahead and unpause it. I'm going to zoom out my view a little bit, and I'm going to start squeezing the trigger to actually laze for the weapon itself. Now we can move the TDC to kind of sweeten up our view of the pod and really get that bomb to hit right in the center of that MiG-21. We'll zoom out the view a little bit. And we should see a good impact. And kaboom. One less MiG-21 in Syria's inventory. I got a little bit nervous on that one because the time to impact actually counted down and went negative for a second. Alright, now our autopilot is a little bit angry with us as to how unbalanced the aircraft is. So at this point, we'll go ahead and flip the autopilot off. And if we let go of the stick, of course our aircraft is going to roll to the right-hand side with that very heavy GBU-10 on the right-hand side. So we're just going to do the same technique that we talked about earlier. We're going to release the stick gently and just be tapping left wing down on the trim hat until it settles out for us. Now at this point we actually have a very, very slight left wing down roll on the aircraft, but you know what? I'm not really worried about it. Keep in mind though that your aircraft is not going to be flying very well or very easily with this asymmetrical of a loadout, especially a little jet with a giant bomb like the GBU-10. Also, at this point, we want to make sure that we're flying out away from the target area, making sure that we give ourselves plenty of separation. I like to fly with new pilots at least 20 nautical miles away from our target before we try to turn back in and acquire a new target. The reason for this is the closer we are to the target in terms of lateral separation, if we want to actually move the field of view of the targeting pod, say from this helicopter over to these helicopters, the pod itself has to move a lot further and a lot faster than if we're nice and far away from the target area and trying to move the pod that same distance. The little motors that move the ball in the front of the pod, as well as the field of view of the pod, are much more likely to fail us and give us weird indications if we are trying to fly right on top of the target area and trying to move the pod around. But if we give ourselves plenty of time and plenty of spacing to fly out away from the target area, it's going to make the entire evolution of coming back for a reattack much, much easier. And we're going to go ahead and come around to the right-hand side. The reason why we're flying away from the target and then coming to the right-hand side is because that pod, of course, is on the right-hand side of our aircraft. That's going to allow us to unmask the pod quicker and then reacquire a target and come in for another attack run. If it's on the left-hand side of the aircraft, there's more likely to actually mask the pod itself and not be able to see the target area. And we're going to continue down this ridge here, and this comes back to that really good spatial situational awareness. We know that if we fly down this ridge, we're going to be more or less perpendicular to the target area. We know that if we continue down this ridge here, we're not going to be closing with on Nazaria Air Base, and we can very safely stand off from the target area, out of the range of SAMs, AAA, or what have you that might be down there shooting at us, and we can zoom back in on our pod and very easily find a new target. So let's go ahead and swap it over to white hot mode, and that might help us pick out some targets here. And it looks like two Mi-24s on the ramp here. Why don't we go ahead and go after those guys? And at this point, you might be thinking, well, Spud, you've only got one bomb left. How can you take out two helicopters? Well, guys, keep in mind, we're thinking about the types of targets that we're engaging. And aircraft are kind of the softest targets you could potentially go after, besides maybe personnel. And so if we put a 2,000-pound bomb right between these two helicopters, I can bet you that these helicopters will never fly again. So we've got our pod on our target, we're good to go there, and we can go ahead and actually start flying in towards our target area. So we're kind of going to do a repeat of what we did before. We're just going to keep our altitude hold on, and we're going to let the jet fly itself. We're also trusting that the pod is going to keep its eyeball, so to speak, on the target we selected, and we're more or less going to ignore it. We can of course kind of look down and check and make sure it's still there, which it is, but we want to keep our head on a swivel, looking around, making sure our velocity vector is staying on the horizon on the HUD, keeping us nice and level flight attitude as we turn back around. And keep in mind, we're going to have to make gentle maneuvers to keep track of the fall line. And to select this point between these two Mi-24s as our new target area, we're going to need to go TMS right in the F-16. If you're flying the F-18, that would be TDC depress. There comes the fall line. And we're going to roll out. And we can see the autopilot trying to catch up from that bit of a too fast of a rollout, but it works. And like I said, we're just nice and gentle stick movements. See how gentle my stick movements are here? Keep in mind that it's going to be a little bit more challenging with this asymmetrical of a loadout having only one GBU-10 on the jet. Whoop, coming a little bit far away from it. Alright, 10 nautical miles from our drop point, 35 seconds out. And we're just gently making gentle corrections here to keep the fall line in the middle of the velocity vector. The further out you can capture that fall line in the velocity vector, the easier it's going to be. Last minute corrections are usually desperate, and as a result are usually far too big and result in an inaccurate drop. This is really where we don't want to over control the aircraft. Here comes our release cue. We're pressing and holding the pickle button. Weapon away. Alright, now we're rolling to the other side. We're going to start squeezing the trigger. We'll zoom out the targeting pod a little bit here so we can see the impact right between these two helicopters. Being aware of where our throttle is so that way we don't get too slow as we concentrate on lasing. Making sure that our flight attitude doesn't get too high or too low. And here comes the bomb. And kaboom. That is definitely two Mi-24s that are no longer in this world. Alrighty guys, so that is a bit of a walkthrough and kind of some best practices, in my opinion, of when it comes to actually engaging targets with self-designated LGBs. I know this is a skill that's very difficult for a lot of new DCS World pilots, and it can definitely be difficult for veteran DCS World pilots as well if they haven't been practicing it regularly. Keep in mind, guys, that it's all about small corrections, flying the jet gently, flying the jet well as keeping your head on a swivel and keeping your situational awareness up. The more you get sucked into your pod and the more you look at the pod and the more you keep your field of view zoomed in, the harder it's going to be to keep a good situational awareness going and a good picture of what's happening around you. Fly the aircraft first, then drop your laser guided bombs. Fly your aircraft first, then work your targeting pod. Fly your aircraft first and then complete the procedure. Always fly the aircraft first. The better you fly the airplane, the easier the entire procedure is going to go for you guys. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something about it, and I hope it was kind of a good refresher for those guys who already know exactly how to drop laser guided bombs in their favorite aircraft. So, like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and please stay healthy out there, and of course,